Good morning, my dear students. Welcome to a lecture on Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads is a word, a term, a name that you're all familiar with because it immediately brings to our mind the idea of the Romantic Age. In order to understand and appreciate the Romantic Age, what you really need to do is first to have an idea of what the Romantic Age is all about. Remember, when we talk about the Romantic Age, we always say the Romantic Age in England began with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. So what exactly is the Romantic Age and what are the characteristics of the Romantic Age? 1798 to 1835 is the Romantic Age. The most important difference is that it was a total breakaway from the neoclassical age. Subjectivity, the poet moved away from the outside world to his own experiences. Any number of poems that you think of in the Romantic Age begins with I wandered lonely as a cloud, says Wordsworth. My heart leaps up, says Wordsworth. My heart aches, says Keats. And so we can go on and on with examples of how the Romantic Age poetry was basically subjective, not objective, not object-based like the poems of the neoclassical age. The second important characteristic is imagination. These poets believed that one has to fly on the flightless wings of poesy in order to be able to write good poetry. Look at the slide, my dear students, and you will see that these poets moved away from the drawing room of poems like Rape of the Lock to bonding with nature. It was the natural world, the beauty of nature, the hugeness of nature, the awe and wonder that nature inspired in them that attracted these poets. The language of the poems that these romantic poets wrote was necessarily simple. They believed that since their themes dealt with common people, the language should also be that used by the common person, by the ordinary rustic folk of England of those days. In every poem, in fact in every literary text, there is always a what and a how. What is the matter? What is the theme? And the how is the manner, is the language, is the style. To the Romantic poets, what they said was much more important than how they said it. One must have looked at the beauty of the Lake County, which Wordsworth and Coleridge travelled on. I want you to have a glimpse of this beautiful landscape of the England countryside where most of the poems were written, thought of, and you have the two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, there. When we talk of the Lyrical Ballads, we necessarily need to talk about two writers. The writers, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth was Poet Laureate and lived for a long, long time, 80 years, 1770 to 1850. My dear students, you may remember that the French Revolution and the ideas of liberty, fraternity that started in that period was a great influence on the Romantic poets. Wordsworth was inspired by the zeal of brotherhood and mankind. This political zeal also led to literary reform. Remember, I've already mentioned to you how the poems of Wordsworth are very different from the poems that Pope wrote, from the poems of the neoclassical age. In the Romantic poets, there was a psychological curiosity. They were interested in what was happening in the mind of the poet when he wrote his poems. Remember Coleridge's famous theory of fancy and imagination. Remember Coleridge talking about primary and secondary imagination. It is the same psychological curiosity that inspired poets like Wordsworth. The prime concern in most of his poems, you will notice, is the dignity of humblest lives. He bonded with nature, and this is best seen in poems like Tintern Abbey and The Prelude. Unless one hears the poems, my dear students, one does not really understand the greatness of these poets. Can I read to you a few lines from The Prelude, where Wordsworth says, "With a heart joyous, nor scared at its own liberty, I look about, and should the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way, I breathe again. Trances of thought and mountings of the mind come fast upon me. It is shaken off, that burden of my own unnatural self, the heavy weight of many a weary day, not mine, and such as were not made for me." It is this influence of nature that inspires Wordsworth to write poem after poem. Let me read to you a beautiful poem when we want to see the influence of nature. All of us know the poem, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." What is this great influence that nature has upon a poet like Wordsworth? Let me quote the last verse from this poem. "For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils." The spirit of nature that one sees, look at the slide, my dear students. The spirit of nature, in Wordsworth's own words, "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with joy, of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man." What does he find in the mind of man? A motion, a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Wordsworth admits to the influence of nature in his life, in his mind, in his thoughts. It is that which impels him to act. The second important poet when we talk about the Romantic Age, the first generation of the Romantic Age, and more importantly when we think about the Lyrical Ballads, the second important poet is, of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. In quite a great contrast to Wordsworth, Coleridge was interested in the supernatural. When you think of poems like Christabel and The Ancient Mariner, you will notice that the supernatural is present to a great extent in most of his poems. I'm thinking of a poem like Christabel, and again, I would like to read a few lines to you. The poem goes, towards the end of the poem, "A snake's small eye blinks dull and shy, and the lady's eyes, they shrunk in her head, each shrunk up to a serpent's eye, and with somewhat of malice and more of dread, as Christabel she looked askance. One moment, and the sight was fled, but Christabel in dizzy trance, stumbling on the unsteady ground, shuddered aloud with a hissing sound, and Geraldine again turned, and like a thing that sought relief, full of wonder and full of grief, she rolled her large bright eyes divine wildly on Sir Leoline." You remember the story of Christabel, how there is this devilish woman who comes in the role, in the garb of a beautiful woman. When we talk of Coleridge, my dear students, look at the slide. The next poem that you have to think of is Kubla Khan. The Ancient Mariner, of course, is a long poem, but Kubla Khan is a much shorter poem. And I want you to remember that Coleridge was supposed to have written this poem under the influence of opium. It's a beautiful poem where he attempts to describe the grandness of this palace that Kublai Khan built. The poem begins very grandly with a beautiful description, but then somewhere along the line, Coleridge, who was under the influence of opium, comes out of that drugged effect, and the poem remains an unfinished poem. Kublai Khan is an unfinished poem, but even as an unfinished poem, I think it's a great poem. Let me read to you a few lines of Kublai Khan. You may be wondering, where is the Lyrical Ballads? My dear students, this is preparatory to our understanding of the Lyrical Ballads. But oh, I'm reading from the Kublai Khan. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's fail, and amid these dancing rocks at once, and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. And so on goes the description. Kublai Khan, one of the most well-known poems of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge also contributed a great deal to literary criticism of the age. Coleridge's great work, Biographia Literaria, is something that we have to remember when we think of the Romantic Manifesto. Let me read to you a few lines from Coleridge. What is the importance that nature has in his life? O lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is the wedding garment, ours her shroud, and would we aught behold of higher worth, a light, a glory, a fair luminous cloud enveloping the earth, and from the soul itself must be sent a sweet and potent voice of its own birth, of all sweet sounds, the life and element. Let us look at the Lyrical Ballads. Let us look at the 3 editions of the Lyrical Ballads. I shall also be talking to you about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. But the title itself, the Lyrical Ballads. When one looks at the word lyric, one remembers that the origin of the word had to do something with the lyre. Some of you might recall that there were 2 kinds of music, 2 kinds of poems in ancient Greece. And the lyric was a kind of poetry which could be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. L-Y-R-E, my dear students, and not L-I-A-R. The lyre is an ancient instrument, a stringed instrument. And a lyric was originally a poem that was sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. So the word lyrical comes from that, and it somehow reminds us of the rustic bards. You remember these poets who went from place to place singing. They were called the bards. So these rustic bards, you think of them when you think of the word lyrical. And what about the word ballads, my dear students? The ballad, you remember, is a kind of poetry which tells a story. And most of the ballads that have come down to us from ancient times have come because of orality. You understand the word orality. That means an oral telling of these stories. Who listens to stories? The common man. You don't have to be literate to listen to a story. And therefore, the word ballad brings to your mind the idea of oral storytelling among common people. The common man, remember, my dear friends, is very important to Wordsworth and Coleridge and all the other romantic poets, in fact, all the romantic writers. You might recall Charles Lamb and his personal essay. Remember that what they were interested in, Lamb and Hazlitt, if you please, Sade and Byron and Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge. The list can go on and on. All of them were interested in the common man. Look at your slide again, my dear students. So the first edition of the Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798. And it may surprise you to know that it was published anonymously. Though Wordsworth had already written a few poems, he wasn't very sure how it was going to be received, and therefore it was published anonymously. In the 1800 edition, 1800, that is 2 years later, in that edition, Wordsworth added the famous preface to the Lyrical Ballads. In the 1802 edition, there was something more, and that was an enlarged preface. What were these poems about? Why were these poems being written? Both the poets were very clear that these poems were meant to be experiments. You might wonder why these great poets wanted to talk about these poems as experiments. But my dear students, let us remember that today we talk of them as being great poems. 200 years later, we talk of them as being great poets. We talk of the Romantic Age. But we must remember that when these poems were being written, the poets had no idea how they were going to be received. These poets had no idea whether the poems were going to be appreciated. They had no idea whether the reading public of England was ready to give up the neoclassical style of poetry and move on to a completely new one. And that is why they called these poems experiments. The language, they said, was the language of conversation of common people. A lot has been written about Wordsworth's everyday language of everyday men. Can there be an everyday language of everyday men? Who is the everyday man, etc., etc.? Those of you who are doing romantic literary criticism might have come across this major discussion on what constitutes poetic diction to Wordsworth and to Coleridge. Did they differ? Did they agree? You might have heard of such things. But to come back to what we are talking about, and that is the Lyrical Ballads. The three editions of the Lyrical Ballads coming up in quick succession, 1798, 1800 and 1802. Look at your slide, my dear students. I want to talk about why this text was written. Why were the Lyrical Ballads published? The writers themselves say that there are two cardinal main principal points of poetry. Number one is exciting sympathy of the reader. Number two, power of giving novelty by imagination. Let's look at the first one, exciting sympathy of the reader. What does that mean? When you read a poem, do you feel, do you experience what the poet has done? And how is the poet able to do this? Because with his ability for imagination, the Romantic poets, with their ability for imagination, what did they do? They gave you something new, something which you had not experienced, to make something different, to make something unusual, to make something individual. This is what the Romantic poets succeeded in doing. I've been saying again and again, and most of you already do know, that the Lyrical Ballads was a combined effort of two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. They were very clear that there should be a clear division of themes, and therefore Wordsworth said that he would add the charm of novelty to things of everyday. What does that mean? The themes would be from everyday life. The themes would be from everyday life. But then if it's very common, then why are you going to be interested? How are they going to succeed in exciting the sympathy of the reader? So he will have to add some charm. And one must admit that Wordsworth succeeded tremendously in doing this. Whether he's singing of the cuckoo or of the daffodils, whether he's talking about his visit to Tintern Abbey, Wherever you see, in every poem of his, he succeeds in giving the charm of novelty to things of every day. So Wordsworth has decided what he wants to do, and Coleridge too has his own opinion on what he would like to do in the poems of the Lyrical Ballads. Look at your slide again, my dear students. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I've used WW for William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, STC, he said, he would write about persons and characters supernatural, which would lead to a willing suspension of disbelief. My dear students, do you remember when Coleridge was talking about the effect that drama had on us, when he was talking about why one goes to see a play, when he was telling us how best to appreciate a play, he used this wonderful, beautiful, imaginative phrase, willing suspension of disbelief. Here, in the poems, when he talks about the supernatural, he wants the reader to have a willing suspension of disbelief, as it is a very important phrase in Coleridge's criticism, as well as essential for us to appreciate his poems. Let me take a moment to explain what is meant by willing suspension of disbelief. When you go to see a play, when you go to see a movie, when you read a novel, you disbelieve. That means you say, oh, this can't be true. It's happening all the time in the movies that we see. Whether they are blockbusters or whether they are art movies, very often we say, but it doesn't happen like this in life. So we disbelieve. Coleridge agrees that when you go to watch a play, you must disbelieve. But how does this disbelief come? He says it should be a willing suspension. What does that mean? I know it is not true, but I cannot keep saying again and again, I know it is not true. So my disbelief is suspended. It is suspended, right? Not totally given away. So for some time, mofuk rakhvu, if you want in Gujarati, for some time you suspend it, but you do it willingly. That means you do not believe what you see, but you stop disbelieving what you see. I think it's a beautiful phrase which one should be able to understand if one wants to appreciate all the plays, all the movies that we see around us. So this willing suspension of disbelief is essential also for our appreciation of Coleridge's poetry. Because what did Coleridge want to do? He wanted to write about the supernatural. I just read to you a few lines from Kubla Khan, and before that a few more lines from Christabel, and you would realize that all that deals with the supernatural. He says that he would deal with persons and characters of the supernatural. Let's look at the slide again, my dear students. The first edition of the Lyrical Ballads. This is 1798. There were 19 poems by William Wordsworth and only 4 poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was a joint effort. It was a cooperative effort. But yet, my dear students, since Wordsworth had already written quite some poetry before that, since Wordsworth was already known as a poet, it was decided that there would be more poems by Wordsworth. And therefore, there were 19 poems by Wordsworth and only 4 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The second edition, there were some added by Wordsworth and none added by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So the 4 remains, but Wordsworth added 4 more. And in the third edition, remember I talked about the preface and I talked about the enlarged preface. In addition to that, there was an appendix on poetic diction. An appendix on poetic diction, because I've already told you the everyday language of everyday men. So when you have everyday language of everyday men, then obviously there should be some description of what is meant by poetic diction. My dear students, I want you to think of these 2 words, poetic diction, before I come on to the next slide, which is the important poems in the Lyrical Ballads. I want to talk about poetic diction for a moment with you. Because diction, you know the word dictionary, and therefore you know that the word diction means language. Is the language of poetry different from the language used by in everyday conversation, used by common people, used for different occasions? Let not the slide distract you at the moment. I'll talk to you about the poems a little later. But before that, I want you to understand what is meant by poetic diction. Wordsworth added an entire appendix on this because he and Coleridge were not very much in agreement about what constituted poetic diction. They differed, and therefore Wordsworth added his own points on what constitutes poetic diction. When we look at the important poems, that were written in the Lyrical Ballads, SANDHAN-AGIC is a poem that you're all familiar with, a poem that you know, that you've heard about, which was by Wordsworth. When he comes back and when he sees what nature has done, how nature is different, how his attitude to nature has become different now that he is older, this is what one sees in SANDHAN-AGIC. In Rime of the Ancient Mariner, very interestingly, you have this old person who wants to tell a story. He wants to tell the story to someone because he feels that his true penance will come only when he is able to tell the story. And so the poem begins about how he gets hold of a wedding guest, how he does not let him go, and how he wants to tell him the whole story. Rhyme is a song. Mariner is a sailor. And he's an ancient mariner because it is an old mariner, an old sailor who is telling you the story. You have Simon Lee, you have the nightingale, you have expostulation and reply, and you have the tables turned. I'm sure some of you, my dear students, would love such poems like the tables turned. Because this is what most of us would love to do, but are not able to do. And what does Wordsworth advise us to do? Let me read the poem to you a little so that you appreciate what Wordsworth is telling us here. Up, up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening lustre mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, such dull and endless strife, come, hear the woodland linnet. How sweet his music on my life, there's more wisdom in it. My dear students, you'd love this if you can quit your books and go out into the world of nature. But remember, what you're being invited here is to appreciate nature. What kind of nature? Nature which appeals to all the senses. Remember, all our experiences, even our intellectual experiences, reach us through our senses. Because if you're hearing my lecture, it is because your ears are working. If you're watching me deliver the lecture, it's because your eyes are working. So the senses are very important to the Romantic poets. Keats, of course, was the most sensuous of the poets, but Wordsworth too was no less. So he says, quit your books. What's the great philosophy in books? This is what Wordsworth is saying, my dear friends, not me. And he says, how sweet is music. On my life, there's more of wisdom in it than you can find in the books. Let nature be your teacher. This is what Wordsworth says in this beautiful poem called The Tables Turned. In fact, it's quite a favorite in many school textbooks also. So he says, let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. Spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. And then one of my favorite verses, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. One impulse from a wood in springtime may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves, the leaves of the book. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. My dear students, if you want to appreciate the world of nature, you must have a heart that watches and receives. It is with such poems that the Lyrical Ballads were first published. It is with these poems and with poems like these that the Lyrical Ballads continues to be an important work of literature even today, 200 years later. Let's go back to the list that we were talking about and see on your screen that you have the tables turned. And then we've got We Are Seven and Lines Written in Early Spring. All these poems are important. Important because they tell us what the Lyrical Ballads are really about. I want to talk about one or two poems which are very, very different. And here is one poem, Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. I hope you're able to read, my dear students, the description of this forsaken Indian woman. I want you to remember that the Indian woman that we are talking about here is not India as our country, but we are talking about a red Indian woman, right? So the forsaken Indian woman here is the forsaken red Indian woman. The poem looks at the condition of this ordinary woman. I've taken this as an example, my dear students, to show you how Wordsworth writes different kinds of poems. Let us not imagine that all his poems deal only with the beauty of nature. I just read to you a poem called The Tables Turned, where he tells us that nature can teach us much more than books and sages can. That is one kind of poetry. There's another kind of poetry which he describes in, say, the Daffodils, My Heart Leaps Up, or in the Lucy poems, or in the Tintern Abbey, or in the Prelude, where he talks about the different effects that nature has had on him, where he talks about how he came to nature with different approaches. He says that he was like the deer which was bounding. But then, towards the end of his life, the same Wordsworth, towards the end of the great poems that he wrote, Wordsworth could say that it was the guardian, the living spirit, the guide and guardian of his life. To Wordsworth, nature had a pantheistic quality. Nature was almost like God to him. He was a worshipper of nature. And when I use the word worshipper, I don't mean that he was worshipping nature in the form of idols, but he worshipped nature all around him. He worshipped the spirit of nature. He worshipped the beauty of nature. But when I talk about, again and again, of Wordsworth as a nature poet, I want you to also remember that he was a great student of the human mind. I use the word student as somebody who is interested in learning, not a student in terms of someone who is in a school or college to get a degree. So when I talk about Wordsworth as being a student of human experience, I want to give you a poem like Lines, Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. I want you to look at the poem on your screen, my dear, and see what Wordsworth is saying. Before I see another day, oh, let my body die away. In sleep I heard the northern gleams, the stars that were among my dreams. In sleep did I behold the skies, I saw the cracking flashes drive, and yet they are upon my eyes, and yet I am alive. Before I see another day, oh, let my body die away. My fire is dead, it knew no pain, yet it is dead, and I remain. All stiff with ice the ashes lie, and they are dead, and I will die. When I was well, I wished to live, for clothes, for warmth, for wood, for fire. But they to me no joy can give, no pleasure now, and no desire. Then here contented will I lie, alone I cannot fear to die. It's a little difficult, my dear students, for you to imagine who is this forsaken Indian woman. You have to think of the Red Indians as moving from one place to another. So lots of them, hundreds of them are moving, are migrating because of the cruel season probably. Probably because they have no food. Probably because they've got no land to till. Probably because the incoming foreigners have driven them out of their own lands. You have to think of these Red Indians. And they're moving. They're moving further and further. And then you have somebody who is weak, somebody who is ill, somebody who is sick, somebody who is handicapped by physical debilitating disease maybe, by illness maybe, by weakness maybe, and finds it impossible to walk. So what does this person do? That person is left behind. The person cannot move on at the same speed with all the others. So this Indian woman is the forsaken Indian woman. Her family, her friends, they have all moved away. If they have moved away, you understand that she has been forsaken. The desire to live is now dead. And that is why she says, when I was alive, I wanted clothes and I wanted food and I wanted joy and I wanted happiness. She goes on and on. But now, since she doesn't want to live, she can only pray for death. Alone, I cannot fear to die. I want to move from here to a totally different kind of poem. Look at the screen, my dear friends. I have a poem called The Thorn. Now, in a poem like The Thorn, you will notice that there is a combination of both nature and human experience. All of you have seen thorns. And you know that the thorn is not something which one would like to take in one's hand. But here, the thorn is a reference to a big, big tree. So old, and therefore, he says, there's a thorn, it looks so old. In truth, you'd find it hard to say how it could ever have been young. It looks so old and grey. Not higher than a 2 years child, it stands erect, this aged thorn. No leaves it has, no thorny points, it is a mass of knotted joints. A wretched thing forlorn, it stands erect, and like a stone with lichens it is overgrown. I've been talking to you about the language of Wordsworth, the language of the lyrical ballads. I'd like to draw your attention to the kind of imagery that these poets are able to bring. Look at the metaphors, look at the similes. I'm sure you know these figures of speech. These are the commonest ones that you find almost we use every day, even in speech, even in ordinary conversation. I say it's hot as fire. I say it's cold as ice. So too, in poetry, you find metaphors and similes. The thorn is actually an old, old tree. You must have seen, trees where the branches are dead. There are no leaves, but the stump is still standing. The trunk is still standing. Now, this is one such tree. Notice how the description draws to your mind an entire image. If you just shut your eyes and try to imagine what he is talking about, you'll get a picture of the number of trees that you have seen of this kind. Because it has no branches, it has got no leaves. What is its height? No higher than a 2 years child. You can imagine. How tall is it? 3 feet? Because it's only the trunk which is standing. And then there is a mood which is being created. My dear students, that is also important. We don't read a poem just for the description. We read a poem also because what it conveys. And what it conveys is the experience of the poet. What it conveys is the mood. It could be a happy, joyful mood. It could be a melancholy mood. It could be a mood of nostalgia, as you must have read in some poems like Tears, Idle Tears. Of course, another age, another poet. I'm talking of the Victorian poet Tennyson. But you must have seen how each poem creates a different kind of mood. Here, the mood that he is trying to create for us, not trying, I'd say he's succeeding in creating for us, is something of old age and all that goes with it. We have talked of the beauty of nature. Maybe some of you would remember Keats's poem, The Ode to a Nightingale, where he talks about old age, where thin grey hairs sceptre thin and dies, where youth grows pale, So you have the contrast of youth. Here, like rock or stone, it is overgrown. Do look at your poem again on the screen, my dear students. Like rock or stone, it is overgrown, with lichens to the very top, and hung with heavy tufts of moss, a melancholy crop. Up from the earth these mosses creep, and this poor thorn, they clasp it round. They are parasites. You know, the lichens and the mosses, they are parasites. And this poor thorn, they clasp it round so close. You'd say that they were bent with plain and manifest intent to drag it to the ground. And all had joined in one endeavor to bury this poor thorn forever. It looks as if nobody wants this thorn to live. Because remember, it's only a stump. The tree is almost dead because there are no branches, there are no leaves, but the trunk continues to survive. In a sense, probably Wordsworth is always also conveying the idea that life is eternal. Life wants to go on. So whatever the parasites in nature around the trunk, around the thorn might try to do, it continues to survive. It continues to fight. The romantic spirit. Remember, I've already talked about the French Revolution in the beginning of the lecture, if you remember. What it gave to the human mind, the conscious effort for liberty and fraternity, and more importantly, equality. Let us look at another poem. It's called The Idiot Boy. I have tried, my dear students, to give you 3 kinds of poems. Look at the poem on your screen. It's called The Idiot Boy. The first one was Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. The second one was The Thorn. And the third one that I want to talk to you about now is The Idiot Boy. It's 8 o'clock, a clear March night. The moon is up, the sky is blue. The owlet in the moonlight air shouts from nobody knows where. He lengthens out his lonely shout, halloo, halloo, a long halloo. Why bustle thus about your door? What means this bustle, Betty Foy? Why are you in this mighty fret? And why on horseback have you set him whom you love, your idiot boy? So it's, that's a conversational tone. But you notice how simple the poem is. How easily one can understand the feeling that the poet wants to convey. The title itself tells us something about the poem, about the poet, about the characters in the poem. We get to know a lot. I have tried to bring you something about what the Lyrical Ballads is all about. But I think this lecture would be incomplete if I do not talk to you also about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Remember, we think of the preface to the Lyrical Ballads almost as being a separate text in itself. Why do we do that? Why is it that what Wordsworth is saying about what he wanted to do almost seems to be more important than what he did in his poems? You are free to ask such a question, and you would be justified, my dear students, in asking a question. He published the poems. As I told you, 23 poems were published in 1798 in a volume called Lyrical Ballads. You'd be shocked, you'd be surprised to know that there was very, very negative acceptance, I wouldn't even use the word acceptance, reaction to these poems. The criticism that these poems had to face were tremendous because remember, the English reading public had got used to the neoclassical kind of poetry, and suddenly 2 people tell us what kind of poetry we should read, what kind of poetry is important, what kind of poetry should be appreciated. They call their poems experiments, I agree, but yet they are writing a new kind of poetry. So what did Wordsworth and Coleridge do? What did Wordsworth do, in fact, because he wrote the preface? In the second edition, that is in the 1800 edition of the Lyrical Ballads, he wrote something called the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Prastavana, you're familiar with it. It tells us something about the book. Very often in our country, I think all over the world in the publishing industry, the preface could be written by somebody else. For example, R.K. Narayan, who is a well-known Indian novelist, and I'm sure you know his Malgudi days, the preface to his first book was written by Graham Greene. So you could have somebody else writing your preface because that gives you a stamp of approval. If Graham Greene could write a preface, well, there must be something in this novel. And that is why the novel probably gets read or published. Anyway, to come back to my talk about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth wrote this, and today we consider this to be a romantic manifesto. What is it that the romantic age is about? It's almost as if he's beginning, telling us what I want to do. Why am I different? So in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, which is a little long, it's not like the usual preface of about a page and a half. This is a longish preface, my dear students, but I would advise you to read it before you read romantic poetry, or probably after you read romantic poetry. What is it that makes romantic poetry so great? What is it that these poets want to do? And how far do they succeed in what they want to do is what you should be looking at, my dear students. Because literature is also about what the poet wants to say. It's not only about what critics want to say about the poet. And therefore, we look at the preface to the Lyrical Ballads as a romantic manifesto. We look at it as a clear-cut distinction from the neoclassical age. We try to contrast it with the neoclassical age. We also go to the preface to the Lyrical Ballads for that famous quotation, my dear students, about the definition of poetry. All of us know that it is a definition which has come down to us 200 years later also. And what does he call it? It is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. But you just can't have a spontaneous overflow. A spontaneous overflow, you'll have to come back home, as the poets did. As Keats says he did in his Ode to a Nightingale. He heard the song when he was sitting in the garden of his friend's house, but he didn't write the poem there. He came back, and then it is recollected in tranquility. You must have the peace to recollect the same emotions that object of nature inspired in you, evoked in you, and then you begin and write a poem. He then goes on to explain to us who a poet is. I would have loved to read to you passages from preface to the Lyrical Ballads, but as we are very fond of saying, time is always short, and there's so much more that one can talk about when one talks about the Lyrical Ballads. And therefore, I would advise you to go to your library and get a copy of the preface to the Lyrical Ballads and read certainly, number one, the definition of poetry. Number two, who is a poet? And number three, why do I write in verse? This may be a question that students you find yourself asking. Why is it that some people choose to write in poetry? There are some who are fond of saying that poetry is more difficult, but then there have been poets all the time. Ever since civilization began, we have had poets. So that cannot be the reason. So do go to the preface to the Lyrical Ballads and try and read why Coleridge and Wordsworth in particular, decided to write in verse, number one. Number two, you must also read why he says who is a poet, who can be a poet, who decides to be a poet. And of course, I've already given you the definition of poetry. But it would be interesting to read it in Wordsworth's own words, because it's always nice to see what the writer has to tell us. My dear students, the Lyrical Ballads is one of the greatest works of literature that has come down to us. The Lyrical Ballads is not one poem, and therefore, when one hears the term Lyrical Ballads, one need not wonder, how long is the poem? It is not one poem. It's a collection of poems. It's a collection of some of the best poems that have been written in the Romantic Age. And needless to say, the Romantic Age is one of the greatest ages of poetry in English literature. So if you want to appreciate romantic poetry, if you want to appreciate good poetry in the English language, I'm not discounting the Elizabethan age, but if you want to read subjective, imaginative poems that come from the heart of these great poets, you must read the Lyrical Ballads first, read Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then move on to the second generation of poets, and then read Keats and Shelley and Byron to see what great English poetry is all about. I hope you enjoyed this lecture as much as I have enjoyed talking to you about one of the greatest ages in English literature and two of the greatest poets of all times. Go back and read your books, read Lyrical Ballads, and have a good day. Thank you.